that welcome. So as Tony said, I am a clinical psychologist. So I've been working with kids who've experienced trauma and abuse for probably about 12 years now. And when I'm talking about trauma today, I really am talking about repeated exposures to trauma. So it's not a one-off car accident or significant episode that happened. We're actually talking about trauma that happens time and time again for children. And here we're really talking about developmental or relational trauma. So trauma that happens within a child's key relationship figures in their life. So we're talking about exposure to abuse, exposure to neglect, and poor parenting practices. Why is this a significant issue to talk about? Well, obviously the statistics are huge, and this is just for reported cases of abuse. So the last statistics that we have are from 2013 to 2014, and here we're really looking at getting up to 41,000 cases of reported child abuse and neglect in Australia. So every 14 minutes, a child suffers from abuse or neglect. That is reported. And obviously the incidence of unreported abuse is much, much higher than that indeed. About 40% of those cases are emotional abuse, 28% neglect, 19% physical abuse, and 14% for sexual abuse. Now, one of the things that often strikes people is when we think about the long-term outcomes from being exposed to trauma and abuse during childhood, as to which one of these categories of abuse actually produces the longest or the worst long-term outcomes for a child. And generally people will think, it couldn't get any worse than sexual abuse, or being physically abused, that's going to take a long time to overcome. But what we actually know to be true, while physical abuse and sexual abuse are indeed very challenging to experience during childhood, the poorest long-term outcomes actually come from a child who has experienced or has been exposed to neglect, or who has been exposed to domestic violence in their family home. They don't have to experience abuse themselves. Being exposed to domestic violence has one of the poorest long-term outcomes when we're looking at, down the track for kids who've experienced trauma and abuse during childhood. We know that trauma and abuse can have an impact on a child's brain development. It can impact upon a child's sense of self or how they think or feel about themselves. It will absolutely impact upon their school success, their physical development, their social skills, their communication skills, and much, much more. And if we're looking at long-term projections for children who have been exposed to trauma and abuse, we're looking at increased risk factors for drug and alcohol abuse, increased risk factors for mental illness, difficulty developing and maintaining good relationships, unemployment, and all sorts of social disadvantage, which really starts to get that cycle happening where these kids are more likely then to experience that in their relationships as adults as well. So that's just where we're at in terms of what's happening in terms of statistics for trauma and abuse. But what really sort of struck me when I first worked in this field is, why does it have such a big impact? We know it should, inherently just that idea that it's impactful makes sense, but I really wanted to understand why. And the reason that I wanted to understand why was when I first started working with these children, I was the only psychologist on staff of an organisation that was specifically designed to work with children who came from abusive and neglectful backgrounds. And what struck me, and I couldn't get my head around it as a new grad coming out of university, was regardless of the type of abuse these children had suffered, regardless of the environment they were now living in, regardless of whether they were no longer being exposed to abuse, these children all seem to have one thing in common, and that is that they would have meltdowns. They would have meltdowns when they were angry, they would have meltdowns when they were scared, but what I couldn't wrap my head around to start with, they would have meltdowns when they were happy and overly excited as well. And that concept took me on a whole journey of trying to figure out exactly how does being exposed to trauma and abuse impact upon a developing child to the point that they have a real inability to hold any degree of intensity of emotion, and were having what their carers were calling meltdowns, like 2-year-old tantrums, repeatedly throughout their days. And hopefully by the end of my talk today, you'll too have a better understanding of how that abuse translates into those poor emotional regulation skills. So to do that, we're going to have a look at a few key areas today. We're going to have a bit of a brief overview of brain development and how that actually takes place. We're going to look at how trauma and abuse will impact upon a child's developing attachment relationships. My key area will look at how trauma and abuse impacts upon a child's sense of self or self-esteem. And together, how those three areas then produce a whole host of behavioural challenges that as teachers or educators or childcare providers, we have to deal with in that environment as well. So firstly, having a look at how trauma and abuse will impact upon a child's developing brain. And this is a quote that I came across, and it must have been well over 10 years ago now, and it pretty much guided my practice every day when I was working in private practice with these children. And the quote says, "Our brains are sculpted by our early experiences. Maltreatment is a chisel that shapes a brain to contend with strife, but at the cost of deep, enduring wounds." And to understand that quote in a little bit more detail, we're actually going to start by having a look at some basic core facts about how the brain develops. Hopefully for some of you this will be a flashback to undergrad uni or some biological subject you did along the way, but for some of you it might be coming new. So what do we know about the developing brain? Well, 4 weeks after conception, so the brain neurons, which is the name we give to the cells in the brain, are already growing at an astounding rate. So we're growing up to 250,000 new brain cells every minute during gestation. And while the basic structure of the brain is intact at birth, most of the brain's growth actually occurs in the first few years after birth. So if we have a look at some of those figures there, we know a newborn baby's brain weighs 400 grams. By the time the baby is 3 years of age, their brain has now almost tripled in weight, so up to 1,100 grams. But that is just a few hundred grams off the fully developed adult brain. So we know so much growth and development is really occurring during those first 3 years of life. And that's why in recent years, in the last 20 years, we've seen a real big push for early intervention programs, because we know so much of brain development is now set in those first 3 years, and what the work we're doing after that point in time is really trying to go back and redesign and lay foundations that have already been cemented in place. Unfortunately, for the majority of educators, that means that a lot of this brain growth and development has already taken place before we ever get engaged with the child. One of the other things we know to be true about brain development is that it typically takes place from the base of the brain all the way up to the outer edges of the brain. So the first part of the brain to develop is in that rusty brown colour it looks like up there, and this is the brain stem. So the brain stem sort of runs down the back of the spine, sort of at the top of the spine, down the back of the head there. Now our brain stem is responsible for basic life functions: heart rate, temperature control, respiration, sucking reflexes, everything that you need for successful survival at birth. So this is why it's the first area of the brain that undergoes significant development. And it's pretty much fully functioning at birth, but continues to develop up until sort of about 8 months of age. Once we've got our basic life processes down pat, the next part of the brain to develop is the, we'll say the diencephalon there, so it's a bright yellow bit sort of stuck in the middle. Now the diencephalon is kind of like the post office of the brain. It's the sending and sorting area. It receives information coming into it, and it decides where else in the brain it needs to pass that information on to. Just like the post office, that then gives the information to the posties to drop in the appropriate letterboxes. After we've done that bit of the brain, the next part of the brain to develop is the cerebellum. So it's bright green in the picture up here for you, but it's pretty much this chunky lump right on the back of your head here. It sits into your palm. The cerebellum is responsible for coordination of movement, orientation of your body in space, and sort of knowing where your body ends and the next person's body takes off. Up above that, we then move into that pale blue area. It looks a bit aqua in that photo. And this is what we call our limbic lobe. Now, when I'm working with parents and families, one way that I talk to families about these different parts of the brain is to simply use my hand. And if I fold my thumb over, okay, what we have down the back of the thumb here is the brainstem. And then the limbic lobe, all the good stuff in the limbic lobe, the really important stuff, is the thumbnail, okay, tucked deep inside. And then around the outside of the limbic lobe, we have the cortex, or the outer edges of the brain here. So when we're talking about the limbic lobe, it's tucked deep inside, and it's really responsible, really looks after emotions more than anything else. And it's particularly involved in two emotions, anger and fear. So we know that that limbic lobe is a really important part of the brain when it comes to survival responses, and particularly coping with trauma and abuse. And then wrapped around the outside, so all of our digits around the outside there, is our cortex, the outer edges of the brain. So the cortex is responsible for what we call higher order cognitive processes. It's your thinking skills, your decision making, your planning, some of our memories also out in that part of the brain. So it's all of the stuff that develops later on. And it's really for making good decisions. Now, as it says there on the slide, brains are built like houses, and we need to have solid foundations for everything else to develop upon. And we'll come back to that in a little bit. What else do we know about brains? Well, when we think about brain development, we're not actually trying to grow new brain cells, which is what a lot of people think. But actually, when we're born, we have just about all of the brain cells we're ever going to have. We used to think that you didn't grow any new brain cells, but we now know that there are discrete parts of the brain that will regenerate themselves. But in general, when you come into the world, you have all of the brain cells you're ever going to need. So we can see on this far side here that at birth, we have lots of brain cells. But what we don't have is very good connections amongst those brain cells. So they're just sitting very independently, okay? Lots of brain cells, and we can see those tree-like root branches that hang off. Those are called dendrites. And what we need to have good communication channels, this is a bit simplified, but to have good communication channels in the brain, we need lots of dendrites connecting all of the cells, all of the brain neurons to one another, so that we have lots of communication pathways in the brain. So at birth, we have lots of cells, very poor communication or connections between them. By 3 months of age, every time the baby sees something new, tastes something new, encounters something new, experiences something new, it shoots out connections to different parts of the brain. And we can see that it's starting to form lots of connections there. By the time we get to 2 years of age, the baby's now encountered and experienced so many new things that it's got connections going in all different directions. Okay. And it actually starts to become a little bit of a mess. There's just too many things being connected in all sorts of directions. And this is one of my favourite stages in child development, and it's kind of this point where it's like their brains are going too quickly for them to actually get their words out, and they kind of develop this cute little lispy, stuttery thing they've got going on. And I always think about it as just their brains are too busy at that point in time. They're not very efficient because they have too many connections going in each direction. To fix this, what the brain actually does is tidy itself up. So at various points throughout development, there's one sort of in early childhood, a massive one during adolescence, what the brain actually does is decide which of these communication channels are most important to me. And if it's a pathway or a communication pathway in the brain that I use regularly, I'm going to devote some resources and I'm going to make it really strong, quick and efficient. If it's a pathway in the brain that I very rarely use, I used it once because I encountered something, but I never went back to it again, so it's not really a pathway I need to devote any energy or resources to, I'm going to get rid of it. I really just want to keep my key brain pathways. And so the brain goes through a process called synaptic pruning. And it's literally like pruning of trees. We get away any of the growth that we don't think is going to be helpful for the long-term development of the organism, the tree or the brain. So the brain goes from having, again, lots of neurons at birth to forming connections between all of the neurons that it possibly encounters to right over this side actually deciding which of those connections are going to be most important to keep. And it really is a use it or lose it phenomena at this point in time. Pathways that are activated over and over again will be strengthened and maintained. Pathways that are very rarely used run the risk of being pruned away because the brain doesn't see that as being efficient to keep them around. And scientists use the word plasticity to describe this way that an environment around a child will shape their overall brain development. So the more that the brain is exposed to particular experiences, those pathways will be strengthened, and if it's not something we need, it'll be pruned away. But what this quote says is that plasticity is a double-edged sword that leads to both adaptation and vulnerability. Because what if the environment in which you're brought up says that certain experiences are really important to you and you need to build up really strong pathways for those particular experiences, and those experiences may be negative. And if you then leave that environment, so you leave a traumatic or abusive home environment and go to a loving, nurturing environment like a daycare centre or a school or a therapy centre, your brain won't be set up to survive or to function in that particular environment. It's only going to be prepared and shaped to cope in a traumatic, stressful environment. And we'll talk about that a little bit more as well. So if the brain does indeed develop from the base of the brain all the way out to the outer edges, and this happens in a sequential fashion, that tends to suggest that there must be periods in development when parts of the brain are more sensitive or are more likely to be impacted upon by being exposed to trauma and abuse. And the research does indeed seem to hold that to be true. So for example, we know that the sensitive period for the brainstem is really in utero and up to about 8 months of age. And if a baby is exposed to trauma and abuse during that time period, what we would then expect to see is an impact upon their basic life processes that are controlled by the brainstem. And again, the research says that's true. So we know that infants, for example, that are exposed to domestic violence whilst in the womb are actually born into the world with higher resting heart rates. So our heart rate might be beating here, their heart rate's beating here. Okay. They're coming into the world already in a heightened state. Infants exposed to domestic violence in the womb are born with increased muscle tone. So these are the infants that can hold their neck up straight away from birth, which are not meant to be able to do. Okay. They're coming in prepared, ready for action, ready to fight. We said the next part of the brain to develop we were looking at was kind of the cerebellum area. Now the sensitive period for the cerebellum, when lots of sort of organisation and development is occurring, is really from about 9 months to 2 years of age. If you're exposed to sort of poor environment or abuse and neglect during that period in time, so from 9 months to 2 years of age, what we're going to see then is an impact upon your coordination, your muscle control. So the classic example there that lots of educators will relate to, these are the kids that when you tell them to come sit on the mat at the front of the class, They sit on about 3 kids on the way down because they have no idea of where their body ends and the next person's body begins in space. And they tend to be sort of these poorly coordinated children as well. The next part of the brain to develop is the limbic lobe, remembering that's tucked deep inside. This is our fear response centre of the brain, fear and anger controlled by the limbic lobe. If you're exposed to trauma and abuse during sort of about 2 to 4 years of age, you're going to see a very big impact upon your ability to regulate your emotions, but more importantly for me, your ability to be in relationships with other people. Your social skills will often be greatly impacted by being exposed to trauma and abuse during that period of time. That last part of the brain to develop is the outer edges, our cortex. Sensitive period is, again, there's lots happening around this time, but really probably from about 2 to 6 years of age for the cortex. Does anyone know how long your cortex continues to develop for, though? Well into your 20s. Okay. So for females, our cortex is still developing or kind of completing development around 25. For adult males, it's around 27, 28 years of age before the frontal lobes in particular have finished developing. And that's why there's been a lot of push in the media lately to increase the age of voting, driving, drinking, all of those kinds of things, because at 18 years of age, you do not have a fully functioning brain. If you're exposed to trauma and abuse during that 2 to 6 years of age period, what you're going to see is a very big impact upon those higher order cognitive functions. Your ability to pay attention, to organise yourself, to execute commands. You end up looking very much like a child with ADHD. It's also a little bit interesting to note at this point in time that while the brain develops from the bottom all the way to the top, we often start to see things decline in old age from the top all the way down. So the first thing to go is some of your planning, your memory skills, your organisational skills and the thinking skills at the top. Then you can start to get a little bit crotchety, a little bit cranky at times, so your limbic lobe, your emotion management. Then it becomes difficult to move around, and the very last stage is, of course, when your basic life processes switch off. It's not as nice as the journey up, but it does tend to still hold that we kind of deteriorate from the top down. So it's a very, very quick introduction to some of the key aspects of brain development. But what it does do is now let us have a little bit of a look at, well, how do things go wrong if you're exposed to trauma and abuse? And as I kind of alluded to throughout, that the communication pathways that are developed and strengthened under negative conditions prepare children to cope in that negative environment. The result may be a child, however, who has great difficulty functioning when presented with a world of kindness, nurturing and stimulation, such as that found in foster care, in schools, in daycare centres. So time and time again, when I was working in private practice, I was referred kids who were doing fine. They were, I shouldn't say fine, but they were existing. They were coping when they were living in highly traumatic or neglectful backgrounds. Their brain had prepared them to cope. But when we took those kids out of those environments and we put them into foster care, these kids would fall apart. They had no way of coping with an environment that was nurturing, that was stimulating, because their brain had not prepared them for that. They had no communication channels for what to do when somebody shows me kind affection, what to do when I'm presented with toys or games or stimulating colours. Their brains just aren't equipped to cope that way. And we have to spend a lot of time sort of through that transition period. And I'm not suggesting that that means we never remove kids from difficult and challenging backgrounds, but it does mean that when we do make that unfortunate decision that a child does need to be removed, we need to very carefully support them after that point in time to help them cope. And we know that there are structural and functional consequences of that exposure to trauma and abuse for the brain. So this is an image that does the lap of the emails every now and then, just because it has some nice shock value, I think. Has anyone seen that one before? Goes around from time to time. So what we've got here are two functional images of two 3-year-old brains. Okay, on this side here, so on my right, we have a normal child, a normal 3-year-old child. That's what a brain should look like at that age. And then next to that, we have, it's actually a composite image of a number of scans of a number of 3-year-olds who were exposed to extreme sensory deprivation. And a couple of the key things to note, obviously it's a much smaller brain overall, and some of that would be due to lack of nutrition, which leads to less what we call myelination in the brain. So myelination is kind of like the coating that goes around electrical cables. It keeps all of the brain pathways running quickly and efficiently and just protects it. And when you have less myelination in the brain, you end up with that overall smaller brain size. But more interesting than that for me is if we have a look on the brain over on that side, so that would be your right, we've got these really big dark patches in the middle. You see those two big dark spots? That's our ventricles, so that's the supply of blood and nutrients. And what it's suggesting is that the centre part of the brain, so the fear response centre of the brain that's tucked deep inside our limbic lobes, all of those parts of the brain, are really receiving lots of resources. So this is a brain that's prepared to cope with trauma and abuse, but that's coming at the cost of all of the outer edges of the brain. So I'm not sure if you can make it out on that image, but around the edges of the brain there's kind of like this wrinkle, shrivelling kind of effect right around the edge of the brain. And that's what we call cortical atrophy. So the outside part of the brain is literally kind of shrivelling up from lack of use. So this is a brain that's devoting all of its resources to survival, to the parts of the brain that are used for fear, and it's coming at the cost of everything around the outside that brain is likely to need to call upon in school. So your fine motor skills, your gross motor skills, your communication, your planning, all of those things are being compromised because the centre of the brain is being so over-resourced. What we then have is a brain that is chronically exposed to stress and the chemicals and hormones associated with stress. So for most of us, we very rarely actually have to call upon the stress response centre of our brain. You know, we might accidentally step in front of a car and have to jump back. Our stress response system would have told us to get back. We might be experiencing an exam or something else we're experiencing as stressful, and we'll call our stress response system into play for a very short period of time, and then we'll sort of put it back at rest again. But what we know for these kids that are exposed to trauma and abuse during early childhood is that their stress response centre of the brain is frequently activated. And it's so frequently activated that it kind of starts to become overly sensitive. And it will be switched on and come into play even when nothing scary is actually around or nothing dangerous is actually around the child. So what we see is lots of resources going to the stress response centre of the brain. So that's getting too many resources, but coming at the cost of other regions of the brain which aren't being resourced at all. Then we have this stress-induced sensitization, so that after a while, it doesn't have to be anything traumatic that will activate that stress response centre of the brain. For example, I've worked with kids who have a phobia of a particular colour. So anytime they, for example, see the colour green, their stress response centre is switched on and they go into fight or flight mode by the colour green. Okay? Now this originated with a particular perpetrator who may have worn a green shirt when they were exposed to abuse, or they may have been abused and the carpet of the room that they were abused in was always green. Something like that. But now the stress response system of the brain is so sensitised that the colour green itself can actually be an activating event for the child. It doesn't actually need to be anything traumatic or dangerous anymore. So now we've got a child who has a sensitive stress response centre which is frequently being activated, it's frequently switched on. Another key example of this one is a particular child who had been abused several years earlier but had been going okay. And then it was a new year at school and they moved to a new classroom, and then bang, meltdown after meltdown after meltdown. And nobody could put a finger on what was different or what had happened for this particular child. Eventually, when it did come out in the wash and the people kind of got to figuring out what it was, this child's new classroom was actually downwind from the tuck shop several times a day. And this is a child who had been sexually abused repeatedly in the Auskick cafeteria of like the local football club. And so multiple times a day he was being assaulted with the smells that reminded him of the abuse. Obviously he wasn't being abused in the classroom at school, but it felt like it to his body because that stress response system was giving him the exact same warning signs as if he was being abused again. So we end up with kids that just have this persistent fear response, this fear response centre of the brain frequently activated by things that aren't in fact even remotely traumatic or dangerous to them. And what we end up then is with kids that we call hyper-aroused. So these are kids who are frequently on the search, on the hunt for danger. They're constantly looking around, constantly checking to see where is the next threat coming from. They can't settle in your classroom, they can't pay attention to the information you're trying to teach. They're just constantly alert for danger. And I think for me, the easiest way to get you to think about what that would be like for a child is to tell you about a training activity that we used to do. We've been banned from doing it now. We get banned from doing all the good stuff. But I can tell you about it at least still. So a number of years ago, probably 10 years ago, I was sitting in a training event talking about abuse and trauma. And it was just after lunch, we came back from eating, we came into the room and we had a video screen like this above us, and they played this lovely, beautiful imagery for us that basically sort of showed us walking through a short track in a rainforest, getting to a clearing. We walked down a couple of steps, to the base of the clearing, and now we were at this beach. And this was the most beautiful beach that you've ever seen. And the camera just kind of gently panned across the horizon. You're looking at the golden sands and the gentle waves and the clouds drifting by. And the whole time they were playing this video for us, they were playing this lovely relaxation music. It was after lunch, so we were relaxing, we were reflecting, our heart rate is slowing down, our breathing is slowing, our muscles are relaxing. Then they played the whole video clip for us again. So we walked through the rainforest, we got to the clearing, the camera panned across the horizon. But this time, instead of playing the relaxation music, they played the theme song from Jaws. You know what I'm talking about? The dun dun. And what does that music do to you? It creates, I think I'm moving too much, sorry. It creates anxiety, exactly. You're alert for danger because that music tells you something is about to jump out of the water and eat you, okay? And we weren't sitting there relaxed anymore. We were scanning that beach. Where is it coming from? And you're automatically alert. And that's what we say it's like for kids who have a background, or people in general, who have a background of being exposed to trauma and abuse. They're walking through their days with the theme song from Jaws playing in their ears. Look out, something bad's about to happen. Here it comes. Is it round this corner? Oh no, it wasn't there. Oh, the music's getting louder now. It must be coming up to the peak. This must be the point. It's about to happen. And that's their theme song throughout the day. And at that point in time, I was still working at that organisation, but my time there was starting to come to an end. Because that's what I took away from my training day. I went back to my office that I worked in, and I said to myself, we're a specialty organisation for children who have been exposed to trauma and abuse. What does our office do? What does our space say? Does it turn up the volume on children's shark music so that they can't even hear us anymore? They're in such a state of fight or flight. Or does it turn down the volume on their shark music and actually give them a reprieve from that theme song playing in their ears repeatedly throughout the day? So, psychology, we're all about confidentiality. The first thing I do when I see a client, close the door. What does that do to a child's shark music? Turns it right up. What happens behind closed doors? Bad things happen behind closed doors. I was working with some fairly volatile kids at that point in time, so all of our cupboards had locks on them. What do locks say to kids from traumatic backgrounds? Nothing good is ever kept behind locks. And just about everything we were doing as a specialty organisation for working with kids from trauma and abuse would have been putting these kids in a heightened state of hyperarousal. We were turning up the volume on their shark music. So I went into private practice after that point in time and spent a good number, probably the next 5 years, driving around seeing kids where they were safe. Typically it was in schools, because for some reason schools were a sense of consistency and safety, and that's where kids would often work best with me. Or it was bus shelters, or it was parks, or it was even in their home if they were now in a safe environment. But I needed to get to the kids where their shark music was lowest. We often find that because of this hyperarousal, children from traumatic and abusive backgrounds will frequently develop remarkable nonverbal skills, but this often comes at the cost of their verbal development. So these kids are not sitting in classrooms looking at what's on the board, looking at the books in front of them, listening to what's being said. They're watching the body cues of everybody around them, because that's generally the first warning sign that somebody is about to get angry with you, that somebody is about to put you at risk. You know, is it a change in the face? Is it a clenching of the muscles? So they're not paying attention to the words on their screen. They're going, oh, no, she just looks at me a bit funny. Oh, no, what's she doing now? Oh, no, she's walking over there. Oh, she clenched her fists. Is she angry at me? Is that kid over there looking at me funny? Am I getting coppered at lunchtime? And they're paying attention to all of this non-verbal information around them that they're not actually taking in the verbal content that's being delivered. So often they'll come in for assessment of learning difficulties, specific learning disorders, whatever it might be, because they present as such smart kids, but they're so far behind in their schoolwork, they just can't learn. And the bottom point up here says that to learn and take in new information, we know that our brain needs to be in a state of attentive calm. How do you get to a state of attentive calm with shark music blaring in your ears? And generally that's my first intervention that I do when I'm working with schools, is we look to turn down the shark music. How do we make kids feel safe and calm at school so they're actually in a position where they can take in that verbal information? Even though they're very vigilant to non-verbal cues, it's also important to note, however, that they're actually oversensitive to verbal cues. They're not that great at interpreting them. So if we were to rank a series of facial expressions, for example, from incredibly excited to happy to pleased to neutral to a little bit of a frown to angry to furious, and we'd ask these kids to indicate, where does somebody first get upset? Where are they angry? Where do they start to show their displeasure with you? They will consistently say neutral. A neutral face is the first warning sign to them that something is about to go wrong. And so it's very important when you're working with kids that you recognise that you can't even be cranky, you can't even be neutral. We actually have to err on the side of being positive for them to be able to read us as non-threatening. Of course, not all kids go down the hyper-aroused route. There is also a small proportion of children that experience more of a dissociative response as a result of their exposure to trauma and abuse. We typically see it with girls or with younger infants when they've been exposed to trauma. So dissociation is often a glazed over expression. It's that knock knock, nobody's at home, the person seems to be a million miles away. And really it's a coping response from the child. So we used to think that when your stress response system of the brain was activated, you could do one of two things. You could fight or you could flight, you could run away. But we now know you have three options. You can freeze, you can check out, you can sort of remove yourself consciously as a coping mechanism to help you get through that particular environment. And again, I often see this with foster carers when they take newborn or young infants into their care when they've been exposed to domestic violence. And they're just like, oh, this baby is so good, Katie, she's such a dream, she never even cries. Babies are meant to cry. And that's really worrying for me, because then you've got a baby whose primary coping strategy is to go to sleep or check out, not to have asked to have their needs met. And that's a baby that we need to teach that your needs are worth being met, and you bet you better cry when you want it. And we'll sort of do that work for the infant for a little while. Oh my gosh, you poor thing, you must be so hungry. I can't believe it's been 2 hours since you last ate. And we make the big fuss for the baby until they learn that yes, you are meant to actually ask for your needs to be met. And when you ask, they are meant to be met. Somebody is there to feed you. We see dissociation a lot when working with foster carers as well. So they'll have a new child come into the home and they'll very quickly want to assert their sort of particular discipline style or their routine in the household. So they might say something to a child like, it's time to pack up your toys. Seems okay, except it was neutral. And neutral can be perceived as threatening, particularly if I've just joined your household and I don't know how it's run. And then you see the child kind of do the first response, which is just freeze, stop moving. And then the carer can be a little bit sometimes like, well, no, we need to let them know how things work around here. So I asked you to pack up those toys. And they step a little closer, raise their voice a little bit more, and now the child's out of there. Dissociation gone. If it's something you do suspect is happening to a child in your care, very quickly what you want to do is orient them back to the room. So we'll play games with kids in classrooms. So we'll have a standard game like, first one in the classroom to find something red. And then all the kids have to try and find something red. Because to find something red, you have to be in the here and now. You can't still be dissociating. So using tactics like that give them something to do in the present can often be enough to draw them back in. Okay. So that's probably the quickest introduction to brain development you're ever going to get. But what I want you to take away from that portion is just that there are lifelong impacts from being exposed to trauma and abuse. And if we think about that quote at the very beginning, maltreatment is a chisel that shapes a brain to contend with strife. So the brain is very clever. It will learn to adapt to whatever you put in front of it. But that can be at the cost of deep, enduring wounds. So I'll put all of my resources into developing this great stress response system that'll keep me safe at home, but what happens when I come to a different environment? I therefore have no skills for school, for daycare, for education. Another key factor of development that's greatly impacted upon by being exposed to trauma and abuse is the whole idea of attachment. Now, attachment is a word that gets thrown around a lot, but sometimes it's actually quite poorly understood. So attachment is really referring to a special, enduring form of relationship that one person feels for another. But it has to be a hierarchical relationship. Somebody must be dependent upon the other. So you can't be attached to your partner, okay? But you can be attached to your parents, and your children or people in your care can be attached to you. But we can't be attached to people who are at the same level as us. And what the research suggests, and we've known for a long time, but it's still kind of not addressed enough, is that first attachment that you have, that primary attachment relationship that you form, will go on to shape just about all other attachment or all other relationship patterns, I should say, that you have in your life. So patterns that you set up with your particular parents will often be repeated in not only the way you engage with your partner, in the way that you raise your own children, but in the way you engage with peers and friends as well. So we learn particular ways of relating to people, and we'll keep enacting those particular patterns for the rest of our life. Unless you want to change them, and then you can go through therapy and become aware of them and address them. But in general, we kind of just keep repeating the same patterns over and over, which is perfectly fine and more than appropriate as long as you have what we call a secure attachment relationship with your parents. I'm going to start probably at this point. Has anyone heard of the Circle of Security program? No? Okay, the Circle of Security program is an intervention program that's aimed at working around attachment styles between parents and their infants. When we are actually assessing attachment, we tend to use that particular experiment called the strange situation. Has anyone heard of strange situation? Flashback to undergrad uni maybe? So I'll go through it quickly for you. In the strange situation test, what we actually do is bring generally a mother, I'm going to say mother, but it can be the father if he's the primary attachment figure, but we generally bring the mother and the infant into a laboratory setting. It has to be an unusual situation for them because we want to activate the child's attachment system a little bit by making them anxious. So we bring them into a laboratory setting, generally when the child is between 9 to 18 months of age is when we can get a really good gauge of what sort of attachment style they have. And we ask the mum to sit on a chair and read some magazines, and the infant plays on the floor next to the mum, and there's some toys on the floor for them. And the infant will be playing away, and then we ask a stranger, hence it's called the strange situation. So we ask a stranger to come into the room, somebody unknown to the infant. And then we look to see what the infant's response is to that stranger. Then we ask mum to leave and to leave the infant alone in the room with the stranger, and we look what happens. And then we invite mum back into the room, and we're looking to see what happens at the reunion. How does the infant greet the mum upon return? Then a few other bits and pieces happen, but then we'll get the mum to leave and leave the infant alone in the room by themselves. And then we ask the mum to come back in again and greet the infant again, so we get a second reunion opportunity. And it is a little stressful for the new mums to do this one for us. But if you have a securely attached relationship, brief, what we call ruptures in the relationship like this are fine. So typically what we see, so a baby that has what we call a secure attachment to its parents, this is the gold standard, what we're hoping for, is that mum will be sitting on a chair and the baby will be playing next to them, okay? When the stranger comes into the room, so if my mum's here, when the stranger comes into the room, I'm going to want to get closer to my mum. And I'm going to, what we call, close the circle. I'm going to come a little bit closer to my mum and probably have a bit of a wary stare at the stranger. Okay, when mum leaves the room, I'm going to be distressed. And this stranger might be able to comfort me a little bit, but I'm not going to be completely settled. When mum comes back into the room, I'm going to have my hands up in the air, pick me up, comfort me, make it better. And when you pick me up, I'm going to snuggle into you and I'm going to be soothed by your presence coming back to me. I'm probably going to keep my circle a little bit closer. I'm going to stay closer because something bad just happened once. I'm not going to trust that again. But then you're going to leave on me and I'm going to be very distressed without you. Okay? And then when you come back into the room, I'm again going to want to be held and I'm again going to snuggle into you because you're my carer, you make everything better for me. Okay? That's what we call a secure attachment. So in a secure attachment, what we have is the parent doing two important functions. So if you have a look at the hands on this side of the circle, they represent the parent. And what the parent does in a secure attachment relationship is provide two things. One, they're a secure base from which the infant can go forth and explore the world, okay? I can come all the way over here, even though you're over there. So for an infant, the world is a metre away, but I can go forth and explore the world. When something scary happens, though, I need you to do your second function. You need to be a safe haven this time on the bottom of the circle that I can quickly come back to you and you can make everything okay for me again. So you provide a safe place from which I can explore, but you're also a safe haven for me to return to. And that's what we were seeing in that strange situation test with a securely attached infant. I can explore these toys over here, but when a stranger comes into the room, I'm coming back to you, okay? I can be very distressed when you leave the room, but when you come back in, we join up and you're my safe haven again. That's best case scenario. But things can go awry in a number of different ways. Sometimes we get infants that are stuck out on this side of the circle and they neither use their parents as a safe haven or a secure base. They just keep out here exploring the world. So in the strange situation test, here you would have an infant that, mum's over there reading the book and I'm playing with my toys. A stranger came into the room. I got my toys. Mum's leaving. I got my toys. Mum's come back in. Toys. Oh, now she's gone, I'm all by myself. Oh God, good thing I got these toys. And it looks like they're giving no response, that they're not doing any of that circle work. But it's deceptive, because if we actually hook these kids up to some physiological measures, they're actually the most stressed of all of our subgroups of attachment styles, because they're doing all of the regulation for themselves. Nobody's helping out. So they're kind of like a duck whose little feet are paddling under the surface, and they're kind of like looking like they're, you know, taking in these toys, but underneath they're working incredibly hard to sort of regulate themselves. Again, this isn't a bad thing necessarily, it's just a coping strategy that develops. So I'm a bit like this with my mum, because my mum's very much one of those British stiff upper lip, you'll be fine, you know, don't need to parent children, they just take care of themselves kind of thing. And so I wouldn't necessarily seek her, but I do have that with my dad. And so even though, you know, mid-30s now, living 2 states away, when I have a crappy time at work or in relationships, I close my circle by flying back to the Gold Coast for the weekend. So these patterns absolutely continue. We also get people who get stuck on this side of the circle, so they don't separate easily from the parent. So here's my parent reading a magazine, and the stranger comes into the room. I can't get much closer from mum because I didn't really separate, but I'll try and get a little bit closer. Mum's leaving the room and she's literally dragging me out on her coattails because I don't want to be separated from her. Mum comes back into the room, and here's the interesting thing with kids on this side of the circle. When Mum comes back into the room, I put my hands up to be greeted. I want you to pick me up. But when you pick me up, I don't snuggle into you like a securely attached child. I lean back because I can't quite trust that you're going to be able to fix this for me. You've already abandoned me once, I'm not going back for a second time. And the key defining feature of those infants is to stretch away upon trying to be comforted. Again, it's not necessarily a bad thing, but we tend to see this happen on this side of the circle if parents might have had postnatal depression, they might have some mental health concerns, drug or alcohol use, those kinds of things when the infant was young. So they want to get it right so much, and sometimes they do get it right, but then a lot of the time they're misreading the infant's cues, so it's not 100% correct for them. So these infants are like, I'm going to be in your face all the time, because when you get it right, gosh, it feels good. Is today the day you're going to get it? Is it? I'm going to be here. Can I get it from you? Can I get it? Oh, there you go. Look, you looked at me. You got it right. Oh, no, it's gone. All right, I'll stay here. It could come back any second. And they're exactly the same in the classroom. Pick me. Can I go? No, I'll go next. Oh, no, is it my turn? And they're just in your face all the time because they can't sit back and trust that anyone's going to meet their needs. The kids that were stuck on this side of the circle in the classroom, they're the, I know what I'm doing, I don't need any help. I know what I'm doing, don't help me. Scrunch it up, throw it away, because they didn't know what they were doing and then it was wrong, and then they can't actually seek out your assistance. So these patterns will continue into their life, you know, and it will continue into adulthood. Drives my partner insane that I'm over on this side of the circle, because my standard response is, I'm fine, it's fine. And it drives him insane, but I didn't sort of develop that kind of need to go back in. It's fine, we work through it, but you know, this pattern will continue throughout our life in terms of those first styles that we developed with our parents. That's all totally fine. I think I'm moving around too much. The problem happens when we get kids that get stuck in the middle. And here's the ones we really worry about. This is what we call a disorganized attachment style. So kids get stuck in the middle when their parents are frightening to them or are frightened because they themselves are a victim of some kind of abuse. And what that looks like to an infant is, I'll go to my parent because, oh no, I can't, they're scary or scared. I'll go to the world, but that's scary. I'll go up. And they have no way of getting their needs met. And in the strange situation test, what that looks like is absolutely heartbreaking. You can Google videos of this or what a disorganized attachment looks like. But often these infants will just put their arms out and surrender and fall backwards because I can't, up, and they give up. And it's a really heartbreaking one to see. Now, as they get older, These are the kids that spend all the time in the principal's office because they can't be in relationships with anyone. They can't keep peer friendships. They can't get the teacher to help them regulate. They can't use the admin staff or the principal to help them regulate, and they just cause chaos wherever they go. So that slide just goes through everything I've said. We can develop these sort of different ways of working that circle, but that's okay. Where we're really concerned is if you get a disorganized attachment style and get stuck in the middle. What does that have to do with anything? Well, this is one of the key things I found out about when I was working with kids from those traumatised backgrounds that were having meltdowns. Because what happens during development is when you're an infant, your parent takes care of all of your needs. So you're an infant, if you're upset, they rock you. If you're hungry, they feed you. If you're wet, they'll change you. And they do 100% of the regulating. Over time, this develops into a process of co-regulation, where we might play peekaboo, we'll look at one another, we might share a toy together, and together we work to keep ourselves regulated. And then over time, then the infant can take on that work for themselves, and around 3 or 4, we start to see that kids can pull back from the tantrums and actually regulate their emotions a little bit better. But if you miss those steps along the way, if you first don't have somebody to regulate for you, don't then go through the process of co-regulation, you'll find it very difficult to actually be able to self-regulate, to regulate your emotions, be that angry, be that scared, sad, or excited. That's all going to be a challenge for you. If you miss those steps along the way, it's too hard to learn to develop yourself. The other thing we find is you're also not able to rely on others. So to be a healthy adult individual, you need to be able to both fix your emotions, but also call on other people when needed to fix your emotions. And if you haven't trusted that process along the way, that you can call on people to help you regulate yourself, as an adolescent adult, that's going to be a very hard lesson to learn. Okay, so we know that trauma and abuse impacts upon the brain. We know that trauma and abuse impacts upon your attachment relationships, and the research is astounding. It's something like 85% of kids in care will have a disorganized attachment style. So we know it's almost a direct outcome of being traumatised or suffering abuse or neglect is that you will develop a disorganized attachment style. But the third key area which can really be disrupted by being exposed to trauma and abuse as a young child is this idea of self-esteem. And again, another quote, our view of ourselves depends upon how significant others treat us. And here, when I started learning about this, the first time in all of my education that I'd ever heard about this term called intersubjectivity. Does anyone get intersubjectivity in their education background? No? I'd never heard of this before, and I can't believe I didn't. Can't believe it wasn't taught somewhere. But the idea of intersubjectivity, as it was explained to me, is, well, there's two types, I guess. There's primary intersubjectivity and secondary intersubjectivity. Secondary intersubjectivity can be a little bit more easy to see with young children. So if I had my niece here at the moment and I was jiggling her up and down, I'd actually be leaning this way because she's quite chubby, but I'd be jiggling her up and down. And if a stranger was to come into the room, she's about sort of 12 months now, if a stranger was to come into the room, she wouldn't look at she wouldn't look at the stranger to judge the situation. She would look at my face, because children will often view the world the way their carers view the world. So if my face was to show disgust, if my face was to show fear or anger, she would likely become unsettled in my arms. Okay? Without ever making that judgment call for herself, she would rely on me to tell her whether or not the world is safe. So secondary intersubjectivity, a child's view of the world, will depend upon how their carer views the world. Primary intersubjectivity then says pretty much what that quote says. A child's view of themselves will depend upon how their carer views them. So if when I cry, somebody comes, if when I'm hungry, somebody feeds me, if when I'm wet, somebody changes me, if when I'm cold, somebody rugs me up, I'll develop a sense of self as being worthy, as being lovable, as being, I need to be taken care of. If the opposite is true, if nobody comes, or the person who comes mistreats me, I'll develop a sense of self as being undeserving, or worse, I develop a sense of inner badness. And often that's a really hard one for foster carers to get their heads around. Why does this child want to go back to their parent again and again and again? They treat them so poorly, they're so horrible to them, why do they keep going back for more? Well, the child's view isn't that their parent is bad. The child's view is that they are bad and they deserve that abuse. Because during development, that's the core belief that they develop about themselves. I am bad, therefore I am making them do this to me. I need to fix this situation. I need to be better. If only I was good, they wouldn't keep abusing me this way. And it's a core belief and a belief about the self that's really, really hard to shift when you get this in the room with the child. And again, if I could go back and do one thing in my career, I would have learnt this earlier on. Because I spent probably, the first 6 years of working with kids from traumatised backgrounds arguing against it. I'm so fat. No, you're not. I'm twice as big as you. I'm so stupid. No, you're not. You got an A on that test. I'm so ugly. No, you have the prettiest eyes. I spent years arguing against this. And it doesn't do a thing. They actually stop talking to you about the way they feel about themselves if you argue against it. And I had to learn a really hard lesson to sit there, accept it, and get behind the emotion of the statement. That arguing against the statement said to the kids, I don't get it. I don't understand what it's like to be you. But if I was able to sit there and say, it must be really hard to think that about yourself. Or if I knew them well enough, it makes me really sad to hear you say that about yourself. Then we could open up a dialogue and we could have a conversation about it. But when I argued against it, I shut it down. And if I could go back, I would have learnt that lesson a long time ago. And this idea of intersubjectivity changed my whole way of working with kids. I think I first heard about it from an amazing person called Daniel Hughes, who's written some beautiful books around attachment with kids. And, the way he taught it to us was basically, if you don't like a kid, don't work with them. Refer them on. Because if you don't like them, what you're teaching them is to continue to dislike themselves. And if you want to change a child's core beliefs and the way they're thinking about themselves, don't start by changing them, start by changing the way you're viewing them. Because that's the way that they're going to shift their view of themselves. And it totally changed the way that I work with kids ever more after that. And there's very few times I've ever referred on. It's really hard to just like everything about a kid usually. Usually you can find something and then I can start with that, if I can find something. And for me it's really easy because I really like the naughty kids. The ones with spunk, they're the ones that I get referred all the time, and I actually really enjoy that in working with them, so it makes that an easy thing for me to do. But it was a big learning curve for me that if you don't like them, don't work with them, because you're not going to change a damn thing in the way that they feel about themselves. So, even though I know all of that stuff is going on, I very rarely will get a referral that says this child's brain has been changed by being exposed to trauma during development, or this child has poor attachment relationships, or this child has a low sense of self-esteem. What I get is, this child is driving me crazy. This child is having meltdowns. I can't control this child's behaviour. So while I know that those three processes are really explaining a lot of what is going on for kids, that's not usually the reason that they're referred for psychological assistance. But what we do know is that children will display behaviour which is often experienced as difficult and challenging by others. That's an understatement. But it often makes sense if you think about the context of their trauma. If you think about they don't have brain networks to cope with this new environment, or they have a sense of that they deserve this because they're bad on the inside or deserving of being mistreated. Typically, the behaviour is always organised around relieving their stress, relieving their anxiety. They're seldom aware of the reasons for their behaviour or the emotions that precipitate their behaviour. So my bugbear and everything to do with education, I might get sent off the stage for saying this one, is the whole idea of restorative practice and talking to kids and sitting them down and talking about the consequences of their behaviour. If you're dealing with a traumatised child, they have no idea. They very rarely even remember that they did it. And so it's very easy to perceive it as lying when they sit there saying, I didn't do it. Even though you just actually saw them, they have so many defence mechanisms in place that to admit that they did something is actually to admit to that inner badness. And for me, that's just a whole challenging area of the way we often set up discipline within our schools. What we do know about this, I'm talking for traumatised kids, not for the rest of the normal population. But no child is going to be disadvantaged by that. That's the bit where I might get booed off. Alright, the other thing we do know is that chaos is normal to these kids and it feels safer than calm and support. So what happens for these kids, they walk into the classroom at the start of the day, so they walk in and they get to the front door and it's all looking beautiful and calm. Everyone's putting away their lunches and chatting and catching up with everybody. And then, I don't know what to do with that. I don't have any brain networks for calm and supportive. So, I can fix that. I'll kick that kid on the way through, I'll knock that kid's hat off, I'll push those books off that desk, I'll call that one a particular name, and then I'll tell the teacher that she looks particularly fat today. And then I can relax. Because all around me is chaos. I know what to do with that. I've got 1,001 brain networks, 1,000,001 brain networks to tell me what to do with chaos. I can handle stress and trauma and arousal and I now feel relaxed. The problem is that the entire classroom is now in an uproar, if not the entire school, if you get a really good one of these kids. So that for them to create chaos is to actually relieve their anxiety, to help them feel calm, to help them regulate. But that doesn't work for the rest of the school around them, unfortunately. So these kids are unable to control their emotions and they have frequent outbursts. They have what we call poor affective regulation systems. They go from 0 to 10 with absolutely nothing in between. They don't understand that they can convey their displeasure or frustration by getting to 3 or 4 out of 10. They go from 0 to 10, that's it. On the other hand, you can also get those kids that are quiet and submissive and are more likely to be a dissociative response. I find them even more challenging to work with than the outbursts, which not everyone can get that one. They often have difficulties learning in school because they're so busy paying attention to the nonverbal cues, they're not paying attention to what's going on around them. They have difficulties getting along with their siblings or classmates. So these kids, as we said, have very poor attachment styles, and if you have that attachment style that says, I can't let you soothe me, they then can't be in relationships with peers, they can't be in relationships with teachers, they can't be in relationships with principals or other people in the school environment. They have unusual eating or sleeping behaviours. So often these kids steal food. Years after they have a consistent food supply, they're still stealing food. And this is again a really hard one for carers to get their head around. I give them 5 meals a day, Katie. Why are they still stealing food? Because their brain pathways tell them that food doesn't come to them regularly and I need to control my food supply. Brain networks take years to replace. And there's lots of things we can do around that. Sometimes, most of the time I should say, stealing food at night time is the biggest problem for a foster care family. They just can't get around it. And so all we do is we pack a lunchbox to go to bed. Okay? Instead of getting up and disturbing the whole household, give them a lunchbox to take to bed with them. So if they want to eat in the middle of the night, they have their lunchbox handy to them. As long as this isn't a child where we're concerned about obesity, it works perfectly fine. We tend to find that over time, they don't even go into the lunchbox, and years down the track, all they have is a muesli bar in the drawer, the bedside drawer next to them, which might get raided once a month. But they needed to know that the food was there because their brain was telling them it wasn't going to come again. They hadn't had that experience of building up communication channels in the brain that said, food comes regularly, it's okay if I don't eat it all now, I'll get some more again in an hour or two. We also have lots of problems with sleeping and settling. Again, really hard to get to sleep when you've got sharp music blaring in your ears, keeping you awake at all hours. They often attempt to provoke fights or solicit sexual experiences. So if you have a history of sexual abuse, you are at greater risk for being sexually abused again in the future, even by a random perpetrator. And this one, again, I've had so many steep learning curves in my career to date. This was another one for me. Why would you go back for it more? Why would you put yourself at greater risk for it again? And I think it may have been Dan actually who sat me down and said that one to me as well, Daniel Hughes, that the idea of waiting for it to happen is so much worse. This idea that it could happen to me at any point in time is so much more alarming than it actually taking place. So if I can be the one to control the when it happens and who it happens from, I can feel sort of more relieved than this idea of just waiting for it. But the waiting for it to happen, that's unbearable. So I'll put myself in a situation where it's more likely to happen again so that I'm the one that has that control over it. They're often socially and emotionally inappropriate for their age. They're often unresponsive to affection, but on the other hand, they can often have very poor social boundaries and can sort of, again, put themselves in challenging situations. But above all, and I put it in capitals for a reason, these kids have a strong need for control. And just about every referral that comes across my desk says they are controlling or manipulative. And when I read that, I take out the word controlling and I put in fearful. They are not controlling, they are scared beyond belief. And the more controlling a child becomes, it's because they're becoming more fearful of something. And control is their way to get back, reduce that anxiety. But because we have all of those behavioural problems going on, what we end up with is a whole bunch of misdiagnosing of these kids. So this is a real case out of the States. This is an 8-year-old girl, and when we did a review of her case file, this is what she'd been diagnosed with. She'd been diagnosed with ODD, ADHD, a mood disorder, bipolar disorder, PTSD, reactive attachment disorder, primary enuresis, sexual abuse as a child, and physical abuse as a child. And that's what existed in her case file. The problem is, we don't have anything better. We would really like to be able to call it, as it says up there, developmental trauma. And the DSM, the Diagnosis and Statistical Manual for Psychologists, is what we use to label these disorders. It gets reviewed every, I don't know, depending on when it needs to be reviewed, about 10 years from between the last one. And it was just reviewed sort of 18 months ago now, and we were advocating so hard to get developmental trauma disorder in there, and it didn't get in. It got rejected yet again, leaving us with nothing better to diagnose these kids with. We know what's going on, we know why it's going on, we just don't have a good label to use for it. So often what they're going to get is ASD, because they've got emotional and social difficulties and they look very similar to ASD. They've got the control factors that ASD has. ASD also happens to get you funding. So there's a lot of paediatricians that go down that route, and I can understand it because these kids probably need more funding than anyone else in your school environment. If you've got a traumatised child in your school or a daycare situation, you'll know what I mean. They need just about more than any other diagnosis I can think of. So they'll often get ASD, ADHD for that hyperarousal or that difficulty with their frontal lobes coordinating themselves, and they'll generally get an ODD for like behavioural difficulties or a reactive attachment disorder or something else thrown in the mix as well. We're a little bit better off than we were because we can now diagnose PTSD in under 6s, which we never used to be able to do, or PTSD in kids, which we couldn't do previously. But PTSD doesn't really sum it up. It doesn't describe the way the brain has changed, the way that they've struggled to be in relationships. It just deals with the impact of the trauma itself. So we're still at a loss as to what to do, but be aware that if you get a child presenting with all of these different diagnoses, there may in fact be something else going on. And regardless of giving them a diagnosis, what we really need to be focusing on is the behaviour. So Gregory Nicolau said, Behaviour is merely a communication tool. The role of the carer or the worker is to become fluent or proficient in the language of behaviour, as a professional interpreter of any spoken language would be. So what these kids need in the school is an advocate who can interpret their behaviours, who can speak for what's going on for them. But as an education system, and because we've got to look after all of the kids, I get it, what we say to these kids is, stop it. Don't do that. That's inappropriate. As a psychologist, we go, that's amazing, thanks for telling us your story today. Get excited about those behaviours because this is the way the child is communicating what's happened to them. So it can be really, really challenging when working with these kids in that school environment then, particularly when their behaviours are putting other kids, if not teachers, at risk. And we have to put sort of a whole host of measures in place for them. But what I want to do is get in there and figure out what's driving those behaviours. How can we meet that same need in a different way? Now I could come back and do a whole another 2 hours on where do we go and what do we do to help with these kids, and I've got about 15 minutes. Excuse me. So I'm just going to focus on one idea today and get you thinking about one particular direction. What we need to do for these kids is restore a sense of safety and control. And to do this, we really need to focus, I think, on interventions guided by what we call the neurobiology of trauma. So the fact that their brain has been changed by what they've gone through. And to change a brain, you need to have patterned, repetitive and developmentally appropriate activities that occur within a secure attachment relationship. So we bring in the idea of therapeutic reparenting in the classroom. So the neurosequential models of therapeutic is based on the work of Bruce Perry. And if any of this has hit a chord with you today, I would strongly encourage you to look up more of Bruce Perry's work. So Bruce Perry is that upside down triangle that we had earlier on. It'll be on the next slide as well again. So Bruce Perry has the Child Trauma Academy in the States. So if you look up childtraumaacademy.org or just Google Bruce Perry's name, you get a whole heap of resources on understanding and working with kids who've experienced trauma and abuse. But Bruce has this, what we call a neuroarchaeological hypothesis, which is a great word, which says it doesn't matter what type of abuse a child has experienced. What matters is when they experienced it. And remember those sensitive periods we talked about before? Well, when they experience trauma, we need to go back and repair whatever part of the brain was developing at that point in time. So if they were exposed to trauma and abuse in utero or during that first 8 months of life, we need to go back and repair the brainstem. If they were exposed to trauma and abuse from 8 months to 2 years, we also probably need to look at the cerebellum. If they're exposed to trauma and abuse from 2 to 4, we're probably going to have to do some serious work on the limbic lobe. And if anything else was going on from 2 to 6 or even beyond, because it keeps developing into our 20s, you can expect that there's something going on with their thinking skills as well. But remembering that it's like a house, you've got to go back and work on the foundations first. So you have to go back to the lowest part of the brain that could have been impacted by that experience of trauma and abuse. And if you're not sure, you go back to the base and you start with the brainstem. If you suspected things are happening long before you knew about them, you go back and start with the brainstem. How do we start with the brainstem? Okay. Well, you do whatever you would do with an 8 or 9 month old baby. You rock them, you sing them, you stroke them, you play with different textures, all of the things that you would do with an infant. And this is where you need to have a great occupational therapist on board, because they're great at this stuff. So therapy for a child who's experienced trauma and abuse, either in utero or up to 8 months of life, should actually look like skipping, bouncing a ball, running, walking, rocking, fit balls, squeezing stress balls, water therapy, weighted blankets. A lot of ASD interventions work right here. Cushions with textures, swinging, sewing, deep breathing, swinging on hammocks, colouring in. There's a reason behind the mindfulness colouring in crazes. There's actually a study, I forget the authors off the top of my head, sorry, but there's a study that showed one particular school, all they did was get the students to colour in for 5 minutes a day. That's the only change they made. Just for 5 minutes a day, every child in the school had to colour in. And the changes in the behaviour of the school was just astronomical. They did proper stats of, times kids have been sent to the principal, times they need to receive discipline, etc. All they did was just change 5 minutes of colouring in a day. They regulated the kids after lunch. They got their brain soothed, and then their behaviour would improve. Anyway, bread kneading, water play, feather breathing, blowing a feather up and down, anything to do with textures, sand play, Play-Doh, shaving cream. Shaving cream is the world's most beautiful substance for kids and for me. It's both, it is a smell, but it just has such a smooth texture to it. Yeah. So putting some shaving cream on the desk and letting them get into it, write letters into it, draw different facial expressions, whatever. Amazing. Jelly, mud, hand massages, whatever it might be. That's therapy, if you're repairing this part of the brain. Of course, when you're a psychologist and you're paid under the government to deliver Medicare-provided programs, and all we're allowed to do is cognitive behaviour therapy or talk therapy, this stuff is really challenging to deliver. Okay? Because the talking side of stuff doesn't happen until you're looking at the cortex. That's where we'd start doing talk therapy. But it's not what kids need at this point. First, they need to regulate themselves. So when I'm working with schools, and I've had some great schools that have taken this on board, we've got a particularly challenging child. They haven't learned, they're so far behind the peers. The first thing I go in, and when the school has, some of the schools I've worked with have been great and let me write the curriculum for the child, that's what they do for 6 hours a day. We're going to do a lesson on Play-Doh, and then we'll do a lesson on jelly, and then we'll do a lesson on shaving cream. And it sounds crazy, but these kids, without ever actually being taught the curriculum, catch up with their peers so incredibly fast because they're now in a state of attentive calm within the school. They're now actually able to learn and integrate the information. And it doesn't have to be day long. This is some of the severe, these are kids that I've worked with who have come from overseas adoptions. But when you've just got kids in a school environment who have this background, they're still going to need what we call pockets of calm throughout the day. So they don't need this in their whole curriculum, but they're going to need breaks to catch up on this stuff. So we might do English followed by 5 minutes of Play-Doh. Then we might do maths, and I know morning break is a really stressful time, so we might do some bubble breathing and blow some bubbles before we go. And on the way back from first break, gosh, I know if I don't settle you down and help you get back into that learning space, you're not going to take anything in. So we might do another pocket of calm as you return to the classroom. But we're building in pockets of brain regulation activity or brainstem regulation activity throughout the day. And if we get in early enough and do that regularly with you, we can catch you before you have your 10 out of 10 meltdowns. We want to catch you when you're 3 or 4. If we leave it too long, you're going to have a meltdown and there's nothing we can do about that. You can put me in the room, I'm still not going to be able to calm them down. A 10 out of 10, you know what that's like. If you've seen it, there's nothing you can do. But if we instill pockets of calm throughout the day and regulate the brain throughout the day, then we have an opportunity to keep you within a zone that we can work with you, to keep you when you're attentively calm, so hopefully you can pay attention and learn the academic curriculum. When we get our brainstem working, we then can move up to music and rhyme, we can do pen tapping, hand clapping, drumming. Then we can move up to the limbic lobe and we can start doing some art and play therapy. And once we've gone through all of those channels, then we can get to working on the cortex. Now this is fine for you guys and working up to 8 years of age, all of that stuff looks great. The challenge is when you're working with a 15-year-old and you need to repair the brainstem. How do you get a 15-year-old to do some Play-Doh play with you? You'll actually be surprised how willingly they will do it, because often they didn't get any of that along the way. But you do need to find creative ways to work with older kids at times too. So for older kids it might be clay and art, calling it artwork instead of Play-Doh. Or some of the kids I've worked with, they just need a brain break throughout the day and they're not going to do shaving cream or anything with you. So we give them a tennis ball and they go outside and they peg a ball against a wall for 5 minutes and then they come back inside. And you get the dum dum dum, which drives the entire classroom nuts. But for them, it's that rhythm that regulates the brainstem, and then they're set and they can come back in. It's surprisingly how old you can get kids on a trampoline. Generally, if you go on there with them, they'll do it. But for older adolescents that I used to work with when I was doing home visiting, really, really explosive kids, never hurt me once because we always would go on walks. We would go on bushwalks. So I wouldn't do therapy in a classroom, we would walk. And when you're walking, you've got the rhythm, you're regulating your brainstem. So it's finding ways. I mean, there's some kids that I work with that multiple times a day, their teacher will send them on a note with a note for the principal, very urgent note, it has to get to the principal right now. And the note literally says, please send Johnny back to class when you get there. But he needed to get a walk because the walk regulated the brainstem. So we're trying to find ways to build in these brainstem activities to keep them within a zone of attentive calm throughout the day so that they can actually be present to take in that academic curriculum that you want them to focus on. And that's where we start. And as I said, there's hours and hours of other stuff that we need to do later on, but as a starting point and as a school or a daycare environment, that's generally the first port of call, is thinking about what does our environment look like. Do we turn up the volume or we turn down the volume on their shark music? And how can we build in pockets of calm into their daily activities so that we can give them opportunities to regulate from the brainstem up multiple times a day? And it's not a fun intervention for a week. It has to be over and over and over and over again in different ways with different materials, but they have to be regulating their brainstem and activating it over and over and over again if you're going to build a new brain network, which is the point of all of that.